Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of wine trends and passionate people beyond the bottle. I'm Lauren Buzzeo, Managing Editor here at Wine Enthusiast, and in this episode, I'll talk with a few of our talented wine reviewers and editors to debunk some of our favorite, or not so favorite, wine myths. Did you know that all Riesling is not sweet? Or that natural wine isn't necessarily better for you? How about that sniffing a cork isn't just wine snob BS? That's right. We'll tell you why as we dive into these topics, as well as other burning questions and common wine myths that we want to set the record straight for. We'll also provide suggestions for regions and bottlings to seek out and try today to broaden your wine knowledge. So get ready to get your learn on and journey with us on this ride to debunk wine myths. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Barefoot Hard Seltzer. A hard seltzer that's made with real wine? That's right! Barefoot Hard Seltzer is here, brought to you by the nation's most awarded wine brand. Barefoot Hard Seltzer packs delicious flavor into every can with 3 simple ingredients: sparkling water, natural fruit flavors, and real wine. Plus, Barefoot Hard Seltzer is only 70 calories, 2 grams of sugar, and gluten-free. Find Barefoot Hard Seltzer in the hard seltzer aisle in a 12-can variety pack or 4-pack. Barefoot Hard Seltzer, wine glass optional. Okay, to kick off this episode on debunking wine myths, in my mind, there was absolutely no better person to start things off with than Wine Enthusiast's very own tasting director, Alex Peartree. He's constantly tasting wines from all around the world and talking to people nonstop about the stuff, from our readers to retailers to importers to producers. He definitely knows his shit. So, Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Wow, Lauren, thanks so much for that amazing intro. Happy to be here.
You better live up to it. That's all I got to say.
I hope I do.
All right, so I think to kick things off, let's start a little easy, maybe a little overly broad, but that's okay. But this is kind of a common one, especially for the season that we're in. Weather's getting warmer, spring is here, summer's coming, people are thinking about outside drinking. So the wine myth that I want to start off with is the idea that all rosé is basically the same. What are your thoughts on that? True or false?
Absolutely not. I mean, this is definitely an easy one. Rosé itself is such a broad and vast category. And in the same way that there are single varietal bottlings of Pinot Noir or Grenache or Cabernet Sauvignon, there's single varietal bottlings of rosé made with the very same grapes. Or in some cases, like in Provence, they use a blend of grapes, and the blends could be heavy on Grenache or heavy on Syrah or heavy on Mourvèdre, and all of it yields very, very different results.
Right. So to start off, definitely varietal speaking, there's a lot of different characters at play. There's a lot of different options for winemakers to use to make the stuff. And that's inherently going to affect the profiles of the wine, correct?
Correct, absolutely. So like in Provence, they definitely have a more lighter colored rosé, but don't confuse that with something that's lacking in intensity. These wines are incredibly mineral driven and spicy and have really, really beautiful tart fruit flavors. But then when you go to an area like Spain that's using Tempranillo or Garnacha, Grenache, um, it's from a different area. It's from a warmer climate, and the result is something a little bit fleshier, a little bit rounder, a little bit more fuller in body. So it really just depends where you're getting the grapes from, where the grapes are grown, and then what grapes you're using.
Yeah, another example of that is like in South Africa, because I have to talk about South Africa when and wherever I can. You have a lot of rosés that are made with their local grape Pinotage, which is a pretty robust and flavorful grape, and thus produces pretty intensely flavored rosés. But if you're looking at, again, maybe some of the classics like from Provence, although they're not lacking in flavor, they might just be a little bit more nuanced than some of those more expressive varieties.
Exactly. And then even in a specific country like Italy, there's a huge range across Italy in terms of the rosé category, going from north to south. And in the north, you have these amazing Barolino Chiorettos, which are made from the same grapes that go into Valpolicella wines like Amarone.
Mm.
And these are pretty light and citrusy, and pretty pale in color. But then as you get a little bit further south, there's wines made from the grape Montepulciano and Abruzzo that are deeply cherry hued and definitely more robust in style.
So that brings up actually an interesting side thought that pertains to this question, but I feel like there's a little bit of an assumption out there that that rosé is meant to be a very pale, almost watery looking coif, and perhaps even the impression that darker colored rosés are maybe of a lesser quality than pale rosés. I don't necessarily think that that assessment or that connection is true, but I think that it's interesting that I feel like it's out there, and I feel like a lot of it rides on the success and the recent interest in Provençal rosés in particular, and people looking and gravitating towards that style and that general color, color characteristic and associating that with quality, but it's totally not true, right?
No, it's definitely not true. And yeah, as you said, I think it just kind of rides with the fad of Provence being the apex of the rosé category. But as people become more familiar with rosé across the world, I think they'll realize that that doesn't hold its salt at all. I mean, there are definitely great examples of rosé that are quality from other areas, and they're darker in style.
Yeah, I mean, one of those being like Tavel in nearby Rhone Valley from Provence, another iconic region. Those are beautiful wines that are pretty robust and dark in color, and actually that have more longevity than I think that people would immediately suspect or associate with the category as a whole.
Absolutely, and I think that's another great thing to bring up is the longevity of rosé. While I would say that a good number of the rosés on the market are definitely meant to be enjoyed in the near term, there are certain regions or even producers that produce rosé and it's meant to age in the cellar, if only for, I don't know, a year to a few years down the line. But it's definitely not a forward fruity drink now rosé style. And I would probably put Tavel in that category, as well as some Cerasuolo d'Abruzzos.
Yeah, there's definitely some oak aged examples as well that I would throw into that category. Gerard Bertrand from the Languedoc Roussillon region of France in the south of France makes some beautiful oak aged rosés. Um, but those I think are fantastic examples. Certainly, Desclans, Garus, fantastic examples of how a rosé can actually benefit from a little bit of age.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we hit rosé pretty well. Let's move on to our next myth if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, you're going to love this one because it ties in a little bit to the region that one of the regions that you taste, which would be New York. Uh, so, wine myth number 2, big one out there. All Riesling is sweet.
Absolutely not.
Love the enthusiasm on that response. All
I
right, so
mean,
go.
yeah. Oh my God, where do I even start? So while I would say, first off, that there's nothing wrong with sweet Riesling, but
Yes.
Riesling is an amazing grape that has such an amazing range and style. And
Mm,
it can go from steely, bone dry examples to luscious, fruity, just like incredibly sticky sweet Rieslings.
mm,
And while I would say New York does a great job of hitting all of those examples, um, obviously one of the main regions of Riesling is Germany, and they produce styles all over the place, all the way from the bone dry, full body Grossgewachs, all the way up to ice wine, which is a real treat to try.
Yeah. So ice wine, tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so ice wine is when the grapes are left on the vine and they freeze, and you harvest them. It's freaking cold when you're picking them. I've done it. I only done it once because you only need to do it once to learn.
It's a once in a lifetime experience for most. Yeah.
Exactly. And then they are pressed, and because the water is frozen, you're extracting such little amount of juice out of there, and it concentrates the acidity and the sugars and the flavors all into this sticky sweet syrup that you then ferment, and the result is a gorgeous, delicious ice wine.
My mouth is literally watering right now just thinking about this. But it's also very entertaining and amusing to me that we're talking about this myth that all Riesling is sweet and we're saying absolutely not. But
Absolutely
here
not,
we
but
are.
here's a great
Here we
one.
are waxing poetic about the super super sweet Riesling. Uh,
Ugh.
so but I mean, I think that just emphasizes that there's a reason why Riesling is known for being sweet. And there are some fantastic and beautiful examples of sweet Riesling. But on the flip side of that, it is a shame that people don't know the beauty of dry Riesling and the versatility also, in my opinion, when it comes to pairing it with food and having it on the table.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Riesling is probably one of the most easy wines to pair a meal with, just because it's because of its structure. It's high in acidity, and it has a pretty intense bouquet that can range from lime and lemon to peach and apricot, and in some examples, even more tropical fruits. But all the while maintaining that impeccable balance from its inherent acidity.
Mhm.
So, and the dry styles, um, one of the ones that I tend to gravitate to, and of the styles that I think is consistently dry, are those examples from Australia in the Clarendon Valley.
Mm.
Those ones are consistently done in a dry style, and I think they have a very telltale sort of limey, stony quality to them that I think you could never mistake this wine for being sweet, even if you were like, "Oh no, all Riesling is sweet." And will you try this wine? This is bone dry.
Right, right. You know what it is also? I think that the fact that Riesling is what's considered an aromatic variety, meaning it has these very pronounced, be it floral or abundantly fruity characteristics in its aromas, that people perceive that as that it's going to be sweet on the palate, regardless of whether it actually has the residual sugar and the sugar content to be classified as sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I mean, I would say that not all Riesling has zero residual sugar in it, but
Right.
with the balance of acidity to that residual sugar, um, ones that are labeled dry definitely come off on the palate as feeling dry. They just need that little bit of like residual sweetness to sort of balance it all out so it's not incredibly mouth puckering like you're sucking on a lemon.
Totally. Unless that's like your thing, you know.
Sure, I mean some people like that.
So dry Riesling, you're looking for the word dry. That's mostly going to be in New World regions that you'll see that on labels. When it comes to German wines, classifications for drier Rieslings would be dry or Trocken, as well as potentially you can look into the Feinherb or Halbtrocken categories, which would be slightly off dry. So you're still talking about generally dry in style, just with a little bit of sweetness. Um, any other recommendations for people looking to try dry Riesling?
Yeah, absolutely. In many New World regions, they use what is called the IRF scale, which is the International Riesling Foundation scale. And on the
Mhm.
back of the label, it has a little indicator of where the wine falls on the dry to sweet spectrum. So I think it's a great way to just turn the label over and sort of see where it falls to see if you want more of a drier style or a sweeter style.
Perfect. And then lastly, I can't forget to mention that this Rieslings and dry or slightly off dry Rieslings are my favorite pairings for sushi and slightly spicy food. Uh, what's your favorite pairing for Riesling?
Oh, God.
Too
I gotta
tough?
pick
I
one?
stumped you with this one?
You did.
Oh my God. All right. Don't overthink it. If nothing's coming immediately to mind, we'll let you slide.
Yeah, I can't think of one right now.
Too many options because it pairs with everything. You can't just pick one, right?
Yeah, how can you?
Yeah. There you go. All right. Alex, thank you so much. I think you lived up to the expectations. You hit all the points. I appreciate your time and debunking these first two myths with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Lauren.
Okay, moving along in our debunking wine myths topic today, we now have our contributing editor, Sean Sullivan, joining us. Hi, Sean. How you doing?
Hi, Lauren. Very well. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. I mean, we have some very important wine myths to talk about throughout the episode for sure, but there were a couple, actually, there was really one in particular that when I saw it come in, I knew I had to talk about with you. There was no other person that I could possibly talk about this one with. Are you dying to know what it is?
I am dying to know what it is.
All right. So, the wine myth that we're going to talk about first, that I think you are just going to love talking about and helping to debunk, is the idea that sniffing a cork is wine snob bullshit.
Yes, that is a topic near and dear to my heart.
So, what do you think about that myth? First off, give me a general true or false.
False. Well, to people who say there's no value in smelling the cork and that it's just kind of wine snobbery bullshit, that's just absolutely false. So, I think a lot of people listening will probably know, like, cork taint is a contaminant that ruins wine. It typically comes in through the cork, but it can come in through other sources like a barrel or some contamination in the winery. And so in my tastings for Wine Enthusiast, I see typically annually between 3 and 5% of wines that are corked closed appear to be contaminated by the cork taint, and it has this kind of moldy basement smell to it that can be either very faint or it can be kind of quite prominent and offensive. And it also is something that inhibits your ability to smell wines and an ability to taste wines, even at very low levels, and in fact, levels that might be below your kind of threshold to detect it. So, so why does smelling the cork kind of matter in that regard? Well, because the contamination is coming from the cork in most cases, in my experience. If you're smelling the wet end of the cork after pulling a cork out of a wine bottle, you're gives you a great shot to kind of pick up whether or not that wine is cork contaminated. So a lot of people will say there's no value in it, but it is giving you your first shot at detecting cork taint.
So it's like consider it a first line of defense before you go in for the full sniff in your glass or even that full taste and that first sip, that you can determine if you think that you're going to have some faulty characteristics in your wine. True?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So a lot of people have said, like, there's no value in smelling the cork, and it just makes you look snobby. Just smell the wine and see what's going on in the wine. And I'll tell you why I don't think that's true. So again, the contamination of cork taint is typically coming from the cork. So cut from the cork and then being subsequently transferred into the wine. But the cork taint, it isn't a binary thing where it kind of yes, no. It's really a gradation from potentially no cork taint to very low levels of cork taint to very high levels of cork taint, and particularly on those lower cork tainted bottles, those lower levels. It can be very, very faint when you smell the wine, and it's cork tainted. A lot of the times, you can try it, and you just think it's not very good wine. But if you are smelling the cork in advance of doing that, you have another chance of picking up that cork taint and knowing there's something wrong with that bottle rather than just finding it disappointing.
Right. I guess potentially, are you maybe getting a little bit of a pure aroma, if you will, or an unaffected aroma from direct from the cork as opposed to in the wine, especially after you first pop it and pour some wine. Usually it takes some time for the cork taint to really actually develop the aromas in the glass and to concentrate in the glass for certain people to perceive it. But perhaps without, the other compounds that you're getting from the wine straight from the cork, you might be more sensitive to pick up on it directly from there.
Yeah, that's correct. So, a lot of people will say to me like, "Oh, there's no point in smelling the cork. Cork either smells like cork or it smells like nothing." And first, actually, I will say if you're pulling all these corks and smelling corks, you will notice a range of different odors coming from cork taint to sometimes they will smell a little kind of green peppery or a little mushroomy to being smelling like cork and smelling fairly neutral. In contrast, as you said, like when you are smelling your wine, there's hundreds of different aroma compounds that are kind of competing for your attention at that point. So if the cork taint is very strong, like yes, it's going to kind of rise to the surface. But if it's very low, you're not necessarily going to notice it because all of those other wine aromas are kind of getting in the way. When you're smelling something that's considerably more neutral and smell like the cork, it gives you kind of a purer look at what that taint can smell like.
Yeah, sure. So I think the important takeaway here is, to take pride in your abilities, in your olfactory senses, and take pride in sniffing the cork. Don't fear, it is not BS. If you pick up on something, send it back, get another bottle, try it out, but don't doubt yourself.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I want to touch on one other thing that you mentioned, which was the cork taint becoming more prominent over time. You get, as I mentioned, these kind of competing aroma molecules there. So at lower levels, you're not necessarily going to notice, but sometimes 15 minutes later, a half hour later, even a day later, you come back to that wine, and it's like, whoa, that wine is cork tainted, and that's why it wasn't all that impressive. But again, if you're smelling the cork kind of up front, you've got another shot at detecting that cork taint. And I guess the people who say there's no value in doing it, first off, I disagree from my experience. But secondly, there's no harm in doing it, right?
Right.
Like people will say like, oh, it's just kind of wine snobby, and there's no purpose to it. It's like actually there is a purpose to it, and it is to try to detect cork taint, and it's not like you are harming anybody by smelling the end of the cork. So why not give yourself uh two shots at picking up the cork taint rather than just one shot and smelling the wine.
Right. Respect yourself, respect the wine, and who cares what anyone else thinks is what I say. I'm a proud cork sniffer. So clearly, in case there was any doubt out there, this is a subject that you're very passionate about.
Yeah, I
You're
mean, I also say to people, like, if you went to the grocery store and 5% of what you bought was rotten, you would be pretty upset by that. But somehow, we've allowed that to happen in the wine industry where we have this healthy amount of cork tainted wines out there.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, you're one of our only reviewers that keeps really because you had prior to admittedly joining Wine Enthusiast and reviewing wines for Wine Enthusiast, but you're one of our only reviewers who keeps track of samples that you receive, and your cork percentages, cork taint percentages that you experience. Again, it's clearly something that you're very passionate about. If anyone is interested in learning more, you've written wonderful articles for us that are on winemag.com. We have another one that we're working on editing right now, so we'll be getting that up shortly. All about all of your cork taint questions answered. So definitely be sure to check out winemag.com. Cork taint, Sean Sullivan, if you're looking for more information. Sean, thank you so much for your time. A pleasure talking as always.
Thank you.
All right, I am here with our contributing editor, Christina Picard. Christina, how you doing?
Hi, Lauren. I'm well. Holding up amidst all the madness.
Excellent. You sound so sultry today. Ooh.
Do I? It's that
You
Monday,
do.
that Monday morning growl.
Love it. So, we have a couple of wine myths that I wanted to discuss with you, and I thought there was no better person to speak to a couple of these myths that we received and that we often hear out with consumers and out in market. There was no better person to hit up to talk about these myths than you. So, are you
I'm
ready?
honored. I'm honored, Lauren.
So, the first myth that I'd like to discuss with you is that natural wines are better for you. True or
Yeah.
false?
Oh man, you know what? You're not going to be surprised by this answer. It's complicated. Isn't that the answer for pretty much everything in wine and life in general? It's complicated. I wish I could give a black or white yes or no. As you probably guessed, I have a lot to say on this subject.
I am
uh,
totally floored and shocked. I really thought you were just gonna be like, "Yep, moving on."
moving on. You know me, always want to be just concise, short, and sweet.
Totally, totally, I'm with you. All right, so next question. No.
Oh man. So I will try to answer that. I can't promise that I will be concise, but I will try to answer this the best way that I can because it is a pretty big question, as most things with natural wine tend to be. It's a huge subject, as probably a lot of listeners know. We actually do now have a first sort of beginnings of a certification process happening in France, but for the most part, natural wines don't have a certification. They aren't regulated, so it is a fairly loose category. But assuming that that we are broadly speaking about natural wines as those that are made organically and biodynamically, and then out in the vineyards, and then in the winery are made with as little additions as possible. So very low to no levels of sulfur, native yeast, unfined, unfiltered, minimal oak, et cetera, et cetera. Assuming that we can all agree on that as the definition. I feel like that always has to be the disclaimer before you start talking about natural wine, right?
That is like the Hall of Fame asterisk right there.
No. I know, right? Are they better for you? Well, I think the first question to ask is, are they better for the planet? And I would say in that case, yes, definitely. I think any wine grower who's farming organically, biodynamically, are really committed to it, not just ticking boxes for marketing purposes or just to get that certification and then use for marketing purposes. I think if they are they committed to it and they're doing it for environmental reasons and sustainability reasons, and they're not spraying chemicals, I think that is better for the environment and therefore better for you. There have not been, in my opinion, not enough tests done, but there have been some, to my knowledge, that have shown traces of chemicals, of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides in final wines. So is that better for you? I think so. I would rather not drink even trace amounts if I don't have to of those chemicals. So that's the organic biodynamic side of things. When we're speaking about the winemaking side of things, it gets a lot messier. I don't think that there has been enough done to kind of know what these additives, how much of them end up in the final wine, because you'll talk to some winemakers and they'll say, adding, let's say, tannins from a packet, adding enzymes, these things, there's no trace of them in the final. Once the fermentation process and the aging process happens, there's no trace of these in the final product. But then, on the flip side of that, there are people who say, well, they're additives and additives are additives, and I would rather not drink wines with any additives or with as few amount of additives as possible. We know that these things, of course, won't kill you, but, whether are they better for you or not, probably that doesn't really make a difference. In terms of overall health, because in the end of the day, alcohol is alcohol, right?
Right.
And, I think that it is a cleaner choice overall for the environment because of how little is added in the winemaking process. But ultimately, you're going to feel crap the next day after drinking too much alcohol, regardless, whether it's a
Right.
natural wine or a conventional wine or any of the many, many myriad of wines that would fall somewhere in between. But I don't know. I like to sort of go with the way that I approach wines for me personally. So ultimately, the wine I choose to drink is often in conjunction with the food I choose to eat. So mostly I strive to eat organic and local and in season. And those foods for me are infinitely more flavorful. They're more packed with nutrients. Plus, bonus, I'm supporting sustainability and the environment in my local community. But you know what? There's also times when I just want a pizza or a hamburger or a pack of Oreo cookies or a tub of Ben and Jerry's or whatever. And you know what? I think that that's okay too, because life is all about balance. And if we start thinking about wine in the same way, I think it's positive for ourselves, for the environment, for supporting small producers, but drink the wines that you love and just don't drink too much of them.
Love it. I love that you bring that up also because I think that a second part of that wine myth is that natural wines don't give you hangovers. And I don't know where that came from or where the logic for that really resides, but it is still alcohol. You are still going to have those effects, regardless of whether you drink a natural wine or a commercial conventional wine. It's just, it is what it is, folks. You drink too much, you're going to feel it the next day.
Right. Exactly. And I think sulfur gets blamed a lot. The natural wine conversation always tends to end up around surrounded with sulfur, by how much sulfur is used in conventional wines versus how much is used in natural wines. And that is the case. There is very, very little sulfur used in natural wines compared to conventional. But then, of course, like conventional runs the whole spectrum of, depending on how much is added during the fermentation process, how much is added during bottling. And I think sulfur ends up getting blamed for hangovers a lot, or people being like, oh, I can't drink this wine. I can't drink reds because I have sulfur allergies. And that is true for a very small percentage of people, but people who truly have sulfur allergies also would be allergic to dried fruit and beer. And, sulfur is added as a preservative in a lot of other things besides wine. And so particularly red wines, they say that there's like a protein. And this is I am not a scientist, so this is a little over my head. I'm speaking a little out of turn, but I hear, there's histamines, there's things with, with the phenols on the skins that people think are more likely to cause perhaps worse reactions. Maybe if people, some people will swear they have worse hangovers on reds than they do on whites. But ultimately, reds are also higher in alcohol. So who knows? Who knows
Right.
what we can blame? It's probably the alcohol for most people.
So when it comes down to the question of if natural wines are better for you or not, I think it's fair to boil it down to it's a personal choice, just like buying organic produce or or meat or whatever. You're weighing a lot of different variables, a lot of different factors. Might it be better for you to not have certain ingredients included in the cultivation of these wines? Yes, but it's not a hard scientific fact that it is healthier for you. Fair?
Fair. I'll give you that. I'll give you that, Lauren.
We know where you stand. Don't worry. All right. So moving on. The next myth that I'd love to discuss with you, because I think that it's especially pertinent to one of the regions that you cover and the wines that you taste for Wine Enthusiast. The myth I've heard is that single vineyard wines are better than blended wines. What do you have to say about that?
Well, again, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer for this, or
Come on.
a black and white answer. And again, I'm going to say it's complicated. And I think this is why these myths become myths in the first place, right? There's no sort of easy answer to this, and there's a lot of it is going to be opinion. But I think that we are kind of obsessed in the wine world with categorizing, and I get it. Single varietals, single vineyards are easier to remember; they're easier to wrap our heads around. And there are certainly plenty of very special single vineyard sites around the world, but there are also plenty of really average ones. So then it becomes a question of should you pay more for that average site just because it's come from the one place, just because they're marketing it as it's single vineyard and therefore it's, X amount more expensive. And often the single vineyard has gone into, the priciest oak and it's been hand picked. And fair enough, there has been more TLC in the handling process and the fermentation and aging process of it, but it doesn't necessarily always make it better just because it's single vineyard. And, it's also, isn't there an enormous amount of skill on the winemaker's part just in being able to blend the best traits of each site? So I don't know, maybe it depends on your personality, but I think can't we admire the chef who makes like killer scrambled eggs or the perfect steak as much as we can who, one who works with like dozens of ingredients, putting them together to sort of form one coherent dish. I think, both can be great in their own way, and there's no right and wrong to that. And I think, you were talking about the regions that I review, particularly with Australia being one of them. They have a very long history and tradition of blending wines, and so Australia's history is really of winemaking started with fortified wines. Their move into table wines and fine wines, really the wines that we know primarily from the country today, that tradition started with blending. They would take like some fruit from the Hunter Valley and some fruit from McLaren Vale or Barossa, two or three totally different regions, and blend them together, because they would go, you know what, I get all this characteristic from this vineyard and this from this, and I can get great acidity from this fruit maybe, and great tannin structure from this one, and by combining them I get the best of both worlds. So that's maybe more a winemaking skill. So maybe the conversation is more about, the skill lying more in the winery versus the skill lying more in the vineyard. But there's no right or wrong. I don't think that you need to blindly choose a wine based on the fact that it's single vineyard.
Totally. And as you're talking, there's so many bombs and side diversions that are going on in my brain, talking
I
about
know.
talking about terroir and representation of place and old world versus new world, because of course I wanted to talk to you about this. It's something we've talked about before, just casually, in the tasting room, as it pertains to Australia, because they do have this really rich history of actually relying a lot on their high quality wines being blended wines from different sites. It's only been more recently, I think, in their viticultural history that they've gravitated more towards single vineyard expressions, especially as marketing those as more higher end than some of the blends. But I do think it's an interesting dichotomy between old world and new world, how the new world generally tends to gravitate towards more acceptance of blending and of the winemaking, whereas the old world very often relies on this sort of implied sense of quality that comes from a single vineyard wine.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Australia's most famous wine, and also its most expensive wine, is Penfolds Grange, which is a multi-regional blend. Not only is it a blend of grapes, they have Shiraz and some Cabernet in there, but it's also a blend of regions, which I think um, is an interesting comment, right, on Australia as a whole. But as you say, they've also moved towards more single vineyard sites. But then the total polar opposite of Penfolds Grange is some of the like natty guys that I really like. There's Okota Barrels does a wine called Texture Like Sun that's a blend of a co-ferment of 9 different grape varieties from several different regions. And then there's another conversation to be had around field blends as well, which is a really like old school traditional small scale wine growing, which is where they just put a bunch of varieties all in one plot together. And often you can still go to some old world regions. I've met some like small wine growers in Spain and France, and you'll ask them what's the final blend of their wine, and they'll be like, I don't know. It's just whatever I picked out there. And they can't even tell you, because of course they
Right.
haven't sent it to a lab or anything. They can't even tell you like exactly what the blend is. So there's definitely some generalizations you can make with old world and new world for sure. And the new world is, tends to be always looking towards the old world as well, and to see, what they're doing a little bit. And we are in this age of terroir and single vineyards and revering those. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to, if I had a crystal ball, maybe, maybe we'll be moving away from that. Maybe we already are in some ways, in going back to these blends and celebrating those as well.
Yeah. Well, I think something that's also perpetuating this whole single vineyard, single site expression is sort of a newfound love and appreciation for old vines. They're very much a hot topic right now in the wine world. People love talking about these old vine vineyards, these centurion vines, and the idea is that somehow, because they are old vines, that the quality of the wine that they ultimately yield and produce is of a higher quality than younger vines. So it's interesting how there's sort of these parallel trends that are causing all of them to rise together to prominence and create these expectations of quality when they're not maybe necessarily as inherent as people think they are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some, and I think some would absolutely fit that bill. And certainly, some of the older vines in like Barossa and McLaren Vale, to go back to Australia, are, you know, produce amazing fruit. And then there's others, I've talked to some of the older producers in Barossa that are having to rip up a lot of their old vines. And I was kind of appalled at first. And there is a sadness in that. And I'm certainly not promoting that because I think there's a lot to be said for history, but they were also just like, the fruit is actually not that good. The yields are so low and they've had to rip them up. So there is always that balance of practicality too. And it's easy from a marketing perspective to say, oh, these are old vines and this is a single vineyard and therefore the wine is going to be good. And, sometimes it's the case and sometimes it isn't. And it's also so much depends on the farming. But I do think that ultimately this whole move towards talking about old vines, talking about terroir and single vineyard, even if some of it feels a little bit gimmicky and a little bit of like a marketing ploy or just a way to sort of charge extra money for wines in some ways, even if that is sometimes the case, overall, as a movement, as a shift, I think it's a positive thing in the way that I think natural wine, whether you're a fan or you're not a fan of some of the wines, has been an important shift in the wine world because it has us talking about what's happening in the vineyards more. And I think that conversation for a long time, for decades, was far too focused on what happened in the winery. And so again, being an environmentalist, I guess, or someone who's passionate about the environmental side of wine growing, I think that conversation, just anything that's going to take it out to the vineyards more and talk about how these wines are grown is positive.
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree with you more. But you know what? I love the fact that listeners probably got a really good insight into the world of Christina Picard as it pertains to her wine preferences and and ethical choices on consumption. And can't wait to hear from you more soon in the upcoming episodes. We have an episode coming up on Australian red wine. So looking forward to talking about that.
Yeah, I'm excited about that one. I've got a really interesting guest for that. So be sure you tune in because he's kind of a rock star in the Australian wine scene. So well worth tuning in and hearing what he has to say about what's happening now in modern day Australia.
I think you're the rock star, Christina.
Oh, thanks, LB. Thanks.
All right, before we fall down more rabbit holes, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks, Lauren. A pleasure as always.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. We talked about a lot of different wines today, with many recommendations worth checking out. So please be sure to visit winemag.com/podcast to learn more about these selections and where to find them. Subscribe to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you find podcasts. If you liked today's episode, we'd love to read your review and hear what you think. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? You can also drop us a line at podcast@winemag.com. For more wine reviews, recipes, guides, deep dives, and stories, visit Wine Enthusiast online at winemag.com and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Wine Enthusiast. The Wine Enthusiast Podcast is produced by Lauren Buzzeo and Jenny Groza. Until next time, cheers.